The winter of 1945 found Tokyo suspended in a strange twilight of denial and dread, a city that had not yet admitted to itself that the war was already lost. In the narrow alleyways of Shitamachi, where wooden houses pressed against one another like anxious neighbors sharing secrets, life continued with the stubborn rhythm of routine, even as American submarines strangled the shipping lanes and factories fell silent for want of steel and coal. Mothers queued for rations that grew smaller each week. Children played war games in streets that would soon become unrecognizable, and the old men who gathered at neighborhood shrines spoke in careful whispers about sons who had stopped writing from the front. The city sprawled beneath a cold March sky, its 15 million souls packed into neighborhoods of paper walls and bamboo frames, structures that had withstood earthquakes and typhoons, but were about to face something for which no ancestor had prepared them, something that would arrive on the wind and transform night into a vision of hell itself. 1,500 miles to the south, on the coral airstrips of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, another kind of preparation was underway. The B-29 Superfortresses stood in long silver rows under the tropical sun, each aircraft a miracle of American engineering and industrial might, sleek and enormous, their polished aluminum skins reflecting clouds that drifted indifferently overhead. Inside the briefing rooms, young men from farms in Kansas and factories in Detroit learned the coordinates of their target with the kind of procedural calm that masks deeper uncertainties. General Curtis E. LeMay had made a decision that would haunt military ethics for generations to come. A calculated gamble born from months of frustration and mounting pressure from Washington to demonstrate results. The high-altitude precision bombing campaigns had failed spectacularly, their expensive payloads scattered by jet streams that carried bombs miles off target, their crews harassed by Japanese fighters at altitudes where the thin air made every mission a test of endurance. LeMay studied the intelligence reports and made his choice with the cold mathematics of total war. If precision could not work, then saturation would. If daylight raids were too costly, then darkness would be their cover. And if the Norden bombsight could not hit factories, then fire would consume everything. The orders were unprecedented and unsettling. The B-29s would fly low, stripping away most of their defensive guns to carry more incendiaries, gambling that Japanese night fighters and anti-aircraft batteries were too depleted to mount effective resistance. Each bomber would carry clusters of M69 incendiary bomblets, each one filled with napalm that burned at temperatures capable of melting steel, along with M47 bombs packed with jellied gasoline and white phosphorus that would ignite on contact and could not be extinguished with water. The target was not a factory or a military installation but a neighborhood, a vast residential district where small workshops and homes existed side by side in the kind of dense urban fabric that made precise targeting impossible, even if anyone had wanted to attempt it. The air crews understood what they were being asked to do, though few spoke about it directly during those final hours before takeoff. Some wrote letters home that would not mention the target or the payload. Others checked and rechecked their equipment with the focused intensity of men who needed to keep their hands busy. A chaplain moved among them offering words that seemed increasingly inadequate. As darkness fell on March 9th, the engines began to roar one by one, that distinctive sound of right cyclone radials building to a crescendo that vibrated through bone and earth. 334 B-29s taxied into position and lifted into the tropical night, climbing heavily under the weight of incendiaries, forming up into loose streams rather than the tight formations of daylight raids. The journey would take 6 hours, enough time for fear and resolve to trade places repeatedly in the mind of every airman. Below them the Pacific stretched dark and empty, its vastness a reminder of how far they were from home and how completely this war had consumed the world. In the lead aircraft, the Pathfinders carried special ordnance, napalm bombs that would mark the target with a blazing X visible for miles, a signal that would transform from abstraction to horror as the night progressed. Tokyo slept uneasily that night, though sleep was a relative term in a city where hunger gnawed constantly and sirens had become part of the soundscape of daily existence. Air raid warnings had sounded so many times with so little consequence that they had lost some of their power to terrify. The American bombers usually came in daylight, flying so high they seemed untouchable, leaving vapor trails that schoolchildren watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. Few civilians in Shitamachi understood that the strategic calculus had changed, that General LeMay had decided their homes were more valuable as fuel than as shelter. In the working-class neighborhoods that spread east of the Sumida River, families huddled under thin blankets, trying to conserve body heat and ignore the cold that seeped through walls designed to breathe in summer rather than insulate in winter. The city's air defenses were a shadow of what propaganda claimed, its fighter squadrons depleted by months of attrition, its anti-aircraft guns too few and too poorly supplied with ammunition to mount more than token resistance. Shortly after midnight, the Pathfinders arrived over Tokyo flying at less than 7,000 feet, an altitude that felt suicidally low to crews accustomed to the thin safety of 25,000 feet. The city lay spread beneath them like a detailed map, its blacked-out streets visible only as an absence of light, though here and there small fires from household braziers created pinpricks of warmth in the darkness. The bombardiers released their loads with practiced precision, and the napalm markers fell through the cold air and erupted in brilliant crosses of flame that burned white-hot and impossible to extinguish. Those flames were visible from miles away, a beacon that said, "Here, this is where you pour destruction. This is where 15,000 people per square mile live in houses made of kindling." Within minutes the main force arrived, wave after wave of B-29s opening their bomb bay doors and releasing their clusters of M69 incendiaries, each cluster tumbling through space before breaking apart at 2,000 feet, scattering dozens of individual bomblets across a wide area in a pattern calculated to achieve maximum coverage and overlap. What happened next unfolded with the terrible logic of physics and chemistry combining with urban geography to create conditions that even the planners had not fully anticipated. The incendiaries fell onto roofs and into gardens and through paper screens, igniting instantly on contact and burning with such intensity that what became fuel and paper became ash in seconds. Individual fires merged into larger fires, and larger fires began to behave according to their own savage rules, generating winds that sucked oxygen from the surrounding air and created a roaring updraft visible as a column of smoke and flame that rose thousands of feet into the night sky. The temperature at street level began to climb toward levels that made survival impossible. Heat so intense that metal melted and stone cracked and human bodies simply combusted without direct contact with flame. The firestorm had begun, a phenomenon where fire creates its own weather system and sustains itself by consuming everything that burns, and in a city built of wood and paper everything burned. The people of Shitamachi woke to a nightmare that exceeded the capacity of language to describe adequately. The air raid sirens came late, after the first bombs had already fallen, and by the time families stumbled from sleep into chaos, the streets were already beginning to fill with smoke. Those who ran toward designated air raid shelters found them inadequate and quickly overwhelmed, concrete boxes that became ovens as the firestorm intensified, their occupants dying of suffocation as fire consumed the oxygen outside and smoke poured through ventilation designed for conventional explosions rather than sustained conflagration. Those who stayed in their homes watched helplessly as fire moved from house to house with terrifying speed, jumping across narrow alleyways on gusts of superheated air, igniting roofs before flames ever touched walls. Families gathered what they could carry and fled into streets that had become rivers of fire, where the asphalt itself bubbled and melted underfoot. The bridges that spanned the Sumida River became sites of unspeakable tragedy, as thousands converged on them simultaneously, desperate to escape the advancing flames. People crushed against one another in panic-driven surges that pushed some over railings into water that offered its own form of death, cold and swift for those who could not swim, boiling in places where burning debris had fallen thickly. Others leapt deliberately, choosing the river over the fire, and the water became crowded with the living and the dying and the dead floating together in a grotesque parody of bathing culture. Those who tried to take shelter under bridges found no protection as fire raged overhead and sucked away breathable air, leaving them to suffocate in places they had thought would offer safety. The canals that webbed through the district became barriers rather than escape routes, their surfaces covered with burning oil and floating corpses, their banks lined with people who had collapsed from heat exhaustion or smoke inhalation and would never rise again. Above the Inferno, the B-29 crews experienced their own form of horror, one mediated by altitude and aircraft skin but no less disturbing for that distance. The smell reached them first, a sickly sweet stench of burning meat and hair that penetrated even closed cockpits and made men gag and turn pale in the dim red light of their instruments. The heat rose in columns so powerful that aircraft encountering them were thrown about violently, tossed hundreds of feet up or down by thermals that made piloting an exercise in endurance and luck. Looking down through bomb bay doors or side windows, bombardiers and gunners could see the fire spreading in real time, a living thing that grew and merged and created new patterns of destruction moment by moment. Some crews dropped their loads and fled immediately, wanting no more of this mission than duty absolutely required. Others circled and watched with a mixture of fascination and dread, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be difficult to explain to people who had not seen it, something that sat uneasily in the mind alongside notions of honor and necessity. The raid continued for nearly 3 hours, wave after wave of bombers adding their incendiaries to fires that no longer needed additional fuel but received it anyway in tonnage that exceeded anything yet dropped on a single city in a single night. By the time the last B-29 turned for home, approximately 1,600 tons of incendiaries had fallen on Shitamachi, and the flames were visible from ships 100 miles at sea, a glow on the horizon that sailors mistook for sunrise until they checked their watches and understood they were seeing something else entirely. The firestorm created its own weather, generating winds of hurricane force that howled through burning streets and carried embers miles from the main conflagration to ignite new fires in districts that had thought themselves safe. Ash rose on those winds, fine gray-black particles that would later be described as resembling snow, except this snow was warm and smelled of cremation and fell in quantities that covered everything, coating survivors in a patina of death that would take days to fully wash away. Dawn revealed a landscape transformed into something that resembled photographs from the apocalypse. Where Shitamachi had stood, where hundreds of thousands had lived in neighborhoods of intricate social connection and cultural continuity, there now existed roughly 16 square miles of absolute devastation, a desert of ash and twisted metal where only the largest concrete structures remained standing, and even those were gutted and blackened beyond recognition. The bodies defied counting for days. So many had been incinerated completely or buried under rubble that would take weeks to clear. Initial estimates proved conservative and had to be revised upward repeatedly as the true scale of death emerged from the ruins. 80,000 dead was the first guess, then 90,000, then the number climbed past 100,000, making Operation Meetinghouse the deadliest single air raid in human history, exceeding in one night the death tolls of Dresden and Hamburg and anticipating the atomic horrors that would later consume Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but achieving those casualties with conventional weapons and the simple physics of fire. Survivors wandered through the ruins in a daze, searching for family members or recognizable landmarks in a city that had become illegible, its streets erased, its neighborhoods reduced to coordinates on a map that no longer corresponded to lived reality. Refugee camps sprang up in parks and open spaces, crowded with people who had lost everything except the clothes they wore and the memories that would haunt them. The injured overwhelmed hospitals that were themselves damaged or destroyed, and doctors worked without adequate supplies or pain medication, making choices about who could be saved and who must be left to die as gently as possible. The stench of death hung over the city for weeks, a smell so pervasive that people became accustomed to it, breathing through cloth masks soaked in whatever fragrance could be found, though nothing truly masked the odor of mass cremation. Neither government acknowledged the full truth of what had happened. Japanese authorities downplayed the casualties and suppressed photographs, not wanting to feed panic or provide propaganda to the enemy, maintaining a facade of stoic endurance even as the empire crumbled. American media received carefully sanitized descriptions that emphasized industrial targets and military necessity, avoiding the uncomfortable reality that the vast majority of the dead were civilians, were women and children and elderly, were people whose connection to the Japanese war machine was tangential at best. General LeMay would later admit that if America lost the war, he expected to be tried as a war criminal, but winners write history and the firebombing of Tokyo became a footnote in a larger narrative of just war against totalitarian evil, a strategic necessity in the terrible calculus of ending the conflict. The raids continued, of course, because military logic once set in motion is difficult to stop. Tokyo burned again on subsequent nights, and Osaka burned, and Kobe burned, and Nagoya burned, each city contributing its own harvest of death to a total that mounted steadily toward incomprehensibility. By August, when atomic weapons made conventional firebombing seem almost quaint by comparison, more than 60 Japanese cities had been reduced to ash and rubble, and millions of civilians had been killed or displaced in a campaign that demonstrated both the immense industrial capacity of American war-making and the profound moral compromises that total war demands from its practitioners. The ruins of Shitamachi would eventually be cleared and rebuilt, as cities always rebuild after catastrophe, the new construction rising literally on the ashes of the old, incorporating those ashes into the soil of parks and foundations of buildings. Survivors carried their memories forward into a peace that many had not expected to see. Memories that surfaced at odd moments triggered by smells or sounds or certain qualities of light. The dead remained dead, their names recorded in memorial books that grew too long to read in one sitting, their faces preserved in photographs that yellowed and faded until great-grandchildren looked at them and could not imagine those formal portraits screaming in flame. History moved on, as history does, to new crises and new wars and new technologies of destruction that made napalm seem almost primitive, but the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, remains singular in its concentrated horror, a benchmark against which other atrocities could be measured and found equally terrible but no more so. What remains hardest to grasp even at a distance of decades is the sheer scale of individual suffering that those numbers represent. 80,000 to 100,000 dead is a statistic, but each of those deaths was a universe ending, was someone's mother or child or beloved, was a person with memories and hopes and a future that terminated in smoke and flame and ash. The firestorm did not discriminate between the guilty and innocent because fire cannot make such distinctions, and in a residential neighborhood where small workshops existed alongside homes, where a mother might sew military uniforms in the front room while her children slept in the back, the categories of combatant and civilian had long since become meaninglessly blurred. What happened that night was both a war crime and a military operation, both necessary and unforgivable, both justified by the logic that demanded unconditional surrender and condemned by every moral framework that insists on the sanctity of civilian life. The pilots who flew the mission returned to base as the sun rose over the Pacific, their aircraft lighter by tons of incendiaries, their fuel gauges approaching empty after the long flight. They landed heavily on coral runways and shut down engines that had run for nearly 12 hours straight, and they climbed out into tropical morning that seemed obscenely normal and beautiful after what they had witnessed. Some slept the sleep of exhaustion. Others could not sleep at all, despite their fatigue, finding that closing their eyes only brought back images of fire and smoke and the smell that had penetrated their aircraft. They had done their duty as ordered, had executed a mission planned by generals and approved by politicians, but duty did not erase memory or settle questions that would surface later, sometimes decades later, in quiet moments when the war seemed very far away and very close simultaneously. Tokyo endured, as cities endure, absorbing its trauma into the deeper currents of cultural memory, where it joined earthquakes and tsunamis, and all the other catastrophes that have periodically reset the urban landscape throughout centuries of habitation. The war ended in August with atomic flashes that eclipsed even the firebombing in their concentrated horror, and Japan surrendered and was occupied and rebuilt into something fundamentally different from what it had been. A democracy imposed from outside that eventually took root and flourished in ways the occupiers could not have predicted. The generation that survived the war worked with ferocious determination to create prosperity from ruins, and they succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, building an economic miracle on foundations that included the literal ashes of their predecessors. But prosperity did not erase memory, and on certain dates the memorials filled with offerings and prayers for the dead who had no graves, whose remains had dispersed into air and water and earth without ceremony or marking. The history of that night belongs now to scholars and documentarians, to museum displays and academic monographs that attempt to contextualize and explain what happened within frameworks of military necessity and strategic bombing theory and the brutal arithmetic of total war. The survivors who could speak of it firsthand have mostly passed into death themselves, taking with them the irreplaceable testimony of lived experience, leaving behind recorded interviews and written memoirs that preserve some fraction of the truth but cannot fully convey the sensory totality of living through such horror. What remains is the obligation to remember accurately, to resist the temptation to simplify or sanitize or justify too easily, to hold in mind simultaneously the genuine existential threat that Imperial Japan posed and the genuine innocence of children burning in fires they did not light for causes they did not choose, to understand that both things are true and that their truth does not cancel out but rather complicates our inheritance of that history. The night Tokyo burned stands as testament to human capacity for both endurance and destruction, for technological sophistication deployed toward annihilation, for ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances making impossible choices or having no choices at all. It reminds us that war, even when fought for the most justified reasons, exacts costs that cannot be calculated in advance and cannot be fully repaid. That victory comes stained with ash and questions that resist simple answers. The firestorm consumed 16 square miles of a city and 100,000 lives in 3 hours, but its smoke drifted much farther and its embers remain alive in memory and conscience, demanding that we look directly at what was done and not flinch from the full weight of that seeing, that we honor the dead by refusing to forget them or pretend that their deaths were anything other than tragedy on a scale that overwhelms individual comprehension but must be comprehended anyway, because that is what history demands of those who inherit it. If you found this story powerful, consider subscribing and leaving a like to support more deep historical narratives. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this history struck you the most? What do we owe the memory of those who lived through such nights?